Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My shift at the ski rental lodge ended at 9 on New Year's Eve. Mount Holloway was always packed that night, filled with people who didn't really care about skiing, but wanted the aesthetic, the gear, the photos against the white backdrop of winter. The lodge hired seasonal workers like me to handle the chaos, and since I'd only moved to Vermont that November, barely 2 months in, I took whatever hours they'd give me. The money wasn't great, but it kept me fed and kept me distracted from the fact that I didn't really know anyone yet. That night, things got hectic early. Everyone was rushing to return their equipment before heading down to the bonfire at the base of the mountain. By 8:30, most of the staff had either clocked out or wandered off to sneak drinks from the supply closet. I volunteered to stay behind and finish closing up, not because I was some model employee, but because I genuinely didn't feel like pretending to be social. I hadn't made real friends yet. Staying behind felt easier than forcing small talk with people who already had their groups established. I finished up a little after 9. The last few stragglers stumbled in, dropped off their gear with half-mumbled thanks, and disappeared into the night. I logged the returns into the computer system, did a quick sweep of the floor for forgotten items, locked up the equipment racks, and shut off the lights one by one until the lodge felt like a shell of itself. When I finally stepped outside, pulling my coat tight against the cold, the mountain felt different. Not quiet exactly, just hollow, like most of the life had drained out of it and left something thinner, something emptier behind. The shuttle to the lower cabins had already left for the night, but I didn't bother checking if anyone was still around to give me a lift. My rental place was barely a mile down the service trail. Maybe a 20-minute walk if I didn't stop to rest. I'd taken that trail dozens of times by then, even in worse weather than this. It wasn't difficult. Just straightforward, predictable, safe. The trail runs behind the lodge, cuts through a decent stretch of woods, and eventually spits you out near the access road where the employee housing sits. There's one distinct left turn that marks the halfway point. It's not a real fork in the path, just a curve with a skinny offshoot breaking away into deeper woods. But it's obvious once you've walked it a few times. You see the bent pine tree that looks like it's bowing, and you know you're halfway home. But that night, it just didn't show up. At first, I figured I'd zoned out and walked past it. Easy mistake in the dark when your mind's elsewhere and the snow softens everything into sameness. My flashlight barely reached 10 feet ahead, and the beam kept catching on tree trunks that all looked identical. But after a while, I started to feel uneasy. Not panicked, not yet, but unsettled in a way that made my chest feel tight. The space around me wasn't quite right. The trees felt closer than they should have been, and the silence was too complete, too deliberate. The trail didn't end. It didn't curve back toward familiar ground. It just kept going, stretching out into darkness like it had always been there and always would be. I slowed down, then stopped completely, turning in a slow circle. All I could see were trees, endless identical trees, and nothing recognizable. No landmarks, no trail markers, nothing that told me where I was or how I'd gotten so turned around. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe the GPS could help me figure out where I'd gone wrong. But the signal was bouncing uselessly. The screen just showed a loading wheel and the time, stark and unhelpful. It was 10:17. I blinked at that number, my breath fogging in front of my face. I'd left the lodge just after 9:30, and I hadn't stopped walking. Not once. That didn't make sense. Even if I'd gotten lost, I should have only been out here for 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most. But according to my phone, I'd been walking for nearly 50 minutes without getting anywhere. That's when the cold hit differently. Not just the temperature, but something sharper, something that got behind my teeth and settled into my bones. The air felt thin, like I couldn't get a full breath no matter how deeply I inhaled. My lungs felt tight, constricted, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. Then I saw the lights. They were faint at first, maybe 20 yards ahead, blurred by the trees and the darkness. I headed toward them without really thinking, assuming I'd somehow looped back toward one of the utility buildings or maintenance cabins scattered around the mountain. Maybe I'd walked in a circle without realizing it. That would explain the confusion, the lost time. It had to be something simple like that. But what I found wasn't part of the resort. It was a cabin, old and small, sitting dead center in a clearing I'd never seen before. One porch light flickered above the door, struggling like it was on its last thread of electricity. The windows were narrow and dark, giving nothing away. The steps leading up to the entrance were crooked, sagging with age and neglect, like they'd been holding up that structure for far too long. Snow was banked up against the walls in thick drifts, but the roof was spotless, completely clear, like someone had brushed it clean just minutes earlier. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my boots sinking slightly into the fresh snow. The cabin didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look lived in either. It just looked wrong in some quiet, hard-to-pin-down way that made my stomach twist. For a long minute, I just stood there, trying to figure out how far off the path I must have gone. My first emotion wasn't fear. It was embarrassment, like I'd trespassed onto private property without realizing it and was about to get yelled at by some angry local. I turned to head back, to retrace my steps and find the main trail again. That's when I saw him, a man, maybe 10 feet away, standing just inside the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. I hadn't heard him approach. No crunch of boots in the snow, no snapping branches, no breathing. He was just there, perfectly still, watching me. He wore a long, dark coat that hung past his knees and one of those knit caps pulled low over his forehead. His hands were at his sides, loose and relaxed. His face was blank, expressionless, but his eyes were locked on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I froze completely, every muscle in my body locking up. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady, with no edge to it. Not threatening, just certain. Like he was correcting a mistake I'd made. "You already came inside." I felt my throat tighten. "No, I haven't." He didn't respond, didn't move, just kept watching me with that same flat, unreadable expression. I didn't ask questions. I didn't wait for him to explain what he meant. I just moved, slow and deliberate, around the edge of the clearing, keeping as many trees between us as possible. I didn't turn my back on him. I kept my eyes on him the entire time, watching for any movement, any sign that he was going to follow. He didn't. He just stood there, perfectly still, until the trees swallowed him up and I couldn't see him anymore. I don't remember how long I walked after that. Everything looked the same. The same trees, the same snow, the same suffocating darkness. My phone still wasn't helping. At one point, I started retracing my steps based purely on tree shapes I thought I recognized, praying that my memory was reliable enough to get me out of there. Eventually, somehow, I found my cabin. It was 10 after 11 when I finally got inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the floor with my back pressed against the wall, listening to the silence. Not even wind. Not even the faint rustle of trees. Just this deep, pressing silence. Like the whole mountain had gone to sleep and I was the only thing left awake. At 11:50, someone knocked on my door. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting, and crept toward the entrance. I looked through the peephole, my heart hammering in my chest. It was him. Same coat, same hat. Standing on my porch like he'd been waiting there the whole time. He wasn't shivering, wasn't shifting his weight, wasn't breathing fog onto the glass. He just stood there, perfectly still, staring at the door like he could see through it. Then another knock came, sharp and deliberate. And then I heard it, my voice coming from somewhere behind me in the room. Quiet but clear, unmistakable. "Let him in." That's all it said. Same tone I use when I'm trying to convince myself something's fine. Same rhythm, same inflection. It wasn't just similar. It was me. I know how I sound. I know my own voice. And that was it, speaking from somewhere in the darkness of my own cabin. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to know where it was coming from. I didn't want to see what was standing behind me in the shadows. I bolted for the bedroom, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it with trembling hands. Then I climbed out the window in my socks, hitting the snow hard and running without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the main road and flagged down a snowplow coming up the hill, waving my arms like a maniac until the driver pulled over. I didn't explain much. Just asked to be dropped at the diner in town. The driver didn't ask questions, just gave me a strange look and let me climb into the warm cab. I never went back to that cabin, didn't even pick up my stuff. I called the landlord the next day and said I was leaving the key under the mat. Didn't care about the deposit, didn't care about my belongings. I just wanted out. I took the first bus south that afternoon and found a short-term rental in another state, far away from mountains and woods and trails that don't end. Aidan, my cousin, invited me to spend New Year's at his family's cabin up near Rockwell Lake in northern Idaho. It wasn't supposed to be anything big, no party or celebration, just the three of us. Me, Aidan, and his younger brother, Drew. We'd been close growing up, practically inseparable for most of our childhood, running through backyards and causing minor chaos wherever we went. This felt like a chance to recapture some of that simplicity, that easy connection we'd had before life got complicated. The cabin was deep in the woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that turned to snowpack well before we reached it. The place hadn't changed since we were kids, still standing exactly as our grandfather had built it by hand back in the 60s. It was surrounded by tall pines and an almost aggressive silence, the kind that makes you aware of every sound you make. One floor, one wood stove, a couple of old bunk beds that creaked when you breathed, and a kitchen that smelled like cedar and accumulated dust. There was no cell service out there, which Aidan had emphasized repeatedly like it was some kind of selling point. He kept talking about recapturing rustic purity or disconnecting from the noise of modern life or whatever phrase he'd picked up from some podcast. He'd brought a box of fireworks, way too much firewood for just a few days, and enough beer for 6 people instead of 3. Drew, still the nerd of our little trio, had brought along this crank-powered radio that looked like it belonged in a fallout shelter and a telescope he claimed was for stargazing, but mostly just made him look like he was preparing for the end of the world. I came light, packing just clothes, some snacks, and this vague sense of dread I couldn't really explain or shake. I chalked it up to winter nerves, or maybe just a lack of trust in the whole no signal, no neighbors situation. Something about being that isolated felt wrong, even if I couldn't articulate why. Around 9 that evening, we bundled up and headed outside to prep for the fireworks. The clearing behind the cabin was perfect for it, packed down with snow and open enough to launch without hitting any trees. Aidan was messing with one of the smaller rockets, trying to light the fuse even though the wind kept blowing it out. Drew was pacing in the snow, stomping little patterns with his boots like he was bored or restless or both. Then he suddenly stopped and said, his voice quiet and confused, "Hey, did one of you bring a dog?" We all froze. Aidan looked up from the firework, fuse still unlit in his hand. I turned to follow Drew's gaze. He was staring past the clearing, into the trees. There was something standing there, just beyond the edge of the light. At first I thought it was a stump or maybe a rock covered in snow, but it wasn't. It was upright. It had legs. The shape was vaguely canine, like a wolf or maybe an emaciated bear, but it was too thin, too tall, its proportions all wrong. The limbs were too long for its body, and its head was angled low, like it was sniffing the ground or watching us from beneath lowered eyes. It didn't move. It just stood there in the shadows, silent and still, maybe 30 feet past the tree line. Aidan, trying to act braver than he felt, waved his arms and shouted at it, the way you're supposed to scare off a coyote or a stray dog. Nothing happened. Not a twitch. Not even a shift in weight. Then it did something I still can't fully explain, something that didn't follow the rules of how things are supposed to move. It backed into the woods, but it didn't turn around. It didn't pivot or step backward naturally. It just slid backward into the darkness, legs stiff, body rigid, like it was being pulled by an invisible string. Drew muttered something about mange or rabies and turned back toward the cabin without another word. We all followed, nobody saying much, the fireworks forgotten and half buried in the snow behind us. Back inside, we tried to pretend it was nothing. We opened more beers, fiddled with the radio until we got some static that almost resembled music, and laid out snacks on the counter like that thing hadn't just stood there watching us with its too long limbs and its unnatural stillness. Then the lights started flickering. Not like a bulb dying, but rhythmic, pulsing, like something was deliberately messing with the power. On, off, every few minutes. Aidan figured the generator might be freezing up, which wasn't uncommon in weather like this. Around 10:30, he pulled on his boots, grabbed a flashlight, and told us he'd be back in 2 minutes. Just going to check it out, make sure everything's running smoothly. I stood by the window and watched him head toward the little shed where the generator sat, his silhouette dark against the bright snow. The moon was full and clear, bright enough to see his outline moving steadily forward. He was halfway there when he stopped abruptly, bending down to look at something on the ground. There was a dark trail leading to the shed. Not footprints, just a single continuous line, like something heavy had been dragged through the snow recently. He stepped forward to examine it more closely, the flashlight beam shifting to the left, illuminating the trees beyond the shed. Then the light blinked out. Just like that. No shout. No scream. No thud. He just vanished. I didn't think. I didn't pause to process what I'd just seen. I ran outside, calling his name, my voice breaking in the cold air. Drew followed close behind, slipping once on the icy steps and catching himself on the railing. We found the flashlight lying in the snow, the beam pointing uselessly at the sky. It was still warm when I picked it up. That detail sticks with me, burns into my memory. Still warm, like he'd just dropped it seconds before, like he should have still been there. But there was no blood, no broken branches, no sign of a struggle, just another drag trail, fresh and long, leading away from the shed and disappearing into the black line of trees. We followed it maybe 10 steps, our breath coming in short, panicked bursts before we heard it. A loud, unnatural crack, like frozen wood splintering under immense weight. Then we saw it. The thing was crawling across the tree trunks horizontally, moving sideways along the bark as if gravity didn't apply to it. Its limbs bent at wrong angles, joints clicking audibly with each movement. And dangling from one of its claws, tangled and limp, was Aidan's coat. Neither of us screamed. We just backed away, slowly, carefully. Like animals trying not to provoke a predator they didn't understand. Once we reached the porch, we went inside and shoved the wood stove in front of the door, our hands shaking so badly we could barely grip the metal. We turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening to our own breathing and the occasional crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. Around 11:30, Drew whispered, his voice barely audible, that something was scratched into the windows. I got up slowly and looked, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Each pane of glass had the same mark etched into the frost, circles with slashes through the middle, repeating over and over like some kind of message or warning. We shut the blinds, sat back down on the floor and waited. The fire crackled. The radio started hissing again, even though no one had touched it and the crank wasn't turning. Through the static, we heard breathing, slow and deliberate, rhythmic inhales that shouldn't have been possible through a machine. Then came a new sound, scraping, like fingernails on metal coming from somewhere behind the cabin. The lights cut out completely, plunging us into total darkness. Drew flicked his lighter, the tiny flame barely illuminating his terrified face. I used the brief flicker of light to find the old flare gun hanging over the fireplace. It was ancient, probably hadn't been used in decades, but it was meant for emergencies. For bears. This wasn't a bear. Midnight hit. Outside, we heard footsteps, but not two. 4 at a time, uneven and dragging. Something was moving along the outside wall, inching toward the front door with agonizing slowness. I raised the flare gun with trembling hands, pointing it toward the door. Then there was a knock, one sharp rap, then 2 more, then silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Then a voice, low and calm, just outside the door, spoke clearly. "Happy New Year." It wasn't Aiden's voice. It was something else, something trying to sound human and failing. I fired the flare through the window without thinking. The burst of red light exploded outward, illuminating the clearing in harsh crimson. The thing was right there, standing upright now, arms spread wide like it was welcoming us. Its joints bent outward like a spider opening itself up, and its mouth hung open impossibly wide, revealing rows of something that might have been teeth. Something hit the snow with a dull thud. Aiden's boot. Then the flare went out, and it was gone, swallowed by darkness. We didn't sleep. We just waited, rigid and terrified, for the first grey light of morning. At dawn, we packed what we could with numb fingers and started walking down the mountain. It took us nearly 6 hours to reach the main road, stumbling through snow and exhaustion. Eventually, a snowplow driver spotted us and let us climb into the warm cab without asking questions. He just looked at our faces and understood that something had happened, something we couldn't explain. The official story was that Aiden got drunk and wandered off into the snow. Search teams looked for weeks, combing through miles of frozen wilderness, but they never found anything. Not his body, not his belongings, nothing. Drew and I never went back. We don't talk about that night. We can't. New Year's Eve was supposed to be low-key, and honestly, I was looking forward to it being completely uneventful. I didn't feel like pretending to be excited about another year when I genuinely wasn't. So when my friend Caleb asked if I could watch his place while he and his girlfriend went up to Vermont for the holiday, it felt like the perfect excuse to avoid everything. The house was this older place he'd just moved into a couple months earlier, out in rural northwestern Pennsylvania, a good 20-minute drive from even the smallest town. He'd described it as still a work in progress, which I quickly learned meant it wasn't exactly comfortable yet. The heating was inconsistent, the walls were mostly bare, and there were boxes stacked in almost every corner like he'd given up halfway through unpacking. I got there around 10:30 in the morning on New Year's Eve. Inside, the house felt half lived in, incomplete in a way that made it feel temporary and unfamiliar. Caleb had warned me that the radiator upstairs was busted, so I set myself up downstairs with a couple of space heaters running, a thermos of black coffee nearby, and one of those oversized fuzzy throw blankets that look ridiculous but actually work. By early evening, the snow had picked up significantly. It wasn't a blizzard, not yet, just thick enough to blur the tree line at the back of the yard. You know that kind of snow that makes everything feel muffled and distant, like even sound has to struggle to reach you, that kind. The house stayed quiet except for the occasional mechanical hum of the space heater kicking on and the faint creak of old wood settling. I'd planned to stay up until midnight, mostly just to say I did, to mark the occasion in some small way. I had the TV going on low volume, flipping between random New Year's countdowns that I didn't care about, none of which felt relevant to my life. Around 11:30, I stood up to stretch and refill my coffee. My back popped in a way that made me feel decades older than I actually was. The kitchen window looked out over the backyard, and that's when I saw him. There was someone standing by the trees, not near the house, not walking or moving in any way, just standing perfectly still right where the yard ended and the woods began. At first, I thought maybe it was a tree stump or some weird trick of shadow and light playing with my perception. But the shape was too distinctly human. Shoulders, head, posture, everything. I couldn't see a face from that distance, just a solid, dark silhouette where no silhouette should have been. There was enough ambient light from the porch to make out the basic shape, but not enough to see any detail. The figure stood right in that uncomfortable zone where light faded into darkness, not totally hidden, but not exactly visible either. I stood at the window longer than I probably should have, just watching and waiting for them to do something. Wave, step forward, turn away, disappear. But they didn't move at all. They just stood there, motionless, like a statue placed deliberately in the snow. Eventually, I backed away from the window slowly, my heart beating a little faster than normal, and locked the back door. Then I checked the front door even though I knew it was already bolted. Then I turned off the porch light. I'm not sure why I did that. Maybe I thought if they couldn't see the house clearly, they'd lose interest and leave. Maybe I just wanted to feel less exposed. I sat back down on the couch and tried to convince myself it was nothing. A lost hiker, maybe. A neighbor from farther up the ridge who'd gotten turned around. But that explanation didn't really hold up. Nobody hikes that trail at night, especially not in the cold, especially not on New Year's Eve when everyone's inside celebrating. When the clock finally hit midnight, I heard faint fireworks in the distance, probably coming from town miles away. I didn't go back to the window. I didn't want to know if the figure was still there. At 12:30, there was a knock on the front door. Not loud or aggressive, just two precise, measured knocks, like someone trying not to be rude. The house was so quiet that the sound felt unnaturally sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. I got up slowly, moved toward the front door, and looked through the peephole, my breath shallow and uneven. A man stood there wearing a navy parka, hands tucked casually into his coat pockets. His face was pale but smooth, with no redness or rawness that you'd expect from someone who'd been standing outside in freezing temperatures for any length of time. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't shifting his weight. He wasn't looking around nervously. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing the door. Then he looked up directly at the peephole, like he knew exactly where I was and had been waiting for me to look. That unsettled me more than anything else. The precision of it. The certainty. I asked through the door, my voice cracking slightly at the end, if he needed something. He said, calm and even, that his car had broken down on the ridge, said he just needed to use a phone to call for help. His voice wasn't pleading or upset. It was matter of fact, like this was a routine inconvenience and he was just going through the expected motions. I told him I could call someone for him, but I wasn't opening the door. My hand was already on my phone in my pocket. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that response. That's understandable, he said. No frustration, no pushback, just calm acceptance. I asked who he wanted me to call. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Then he tilted his head slightly, almost curiously, and said, "You're watching the house for Caleb, right?" My blood went cold. I stepped back from the door immediately, still staring through the peephole. I hadn't mentioned Caleb's name. There was no note outside, no car in the driveway that could have told him whose house this was. I'd only gotten the key the day before, and Caleb hadn't posted anything online about being away. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, hands shaking slightly, and stood there with the screen glowing uselessly in my hand. My thumb hovered over the emergency call button, but I didn't press it yet. I kept glancing toward the door, waiting for something else to happen. Then everything cut off. The power went out completely. No flicker, no warning, just instant, total blackness. The TV died mid-sentence. The space heater stopped humming. The fridge went silent. The only sound left was the faint brush of snow against the windows and my own shallow breathing. I stood in the dark for a long moment, listening hard, straining to hear anything that would tell me what was happening. The porch light was out now, so I couldn't see if the man was still standing there. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear him leave. I went into the kitchen, fumbling through drawers until I found the one where Caleb kept emergency candles. I struck a lighter with trembling fingers and got one lit, the small flame casting flickering shadows across the walls. That's when I heard it, a faint creak from the back of the house, just barely audible. The sound of the back door shifting slightly against its frame. I froze completely, the candle trembling in my hand. No footsteps, no voice. Just that soft, deliberate sound of wood moving against metal. I crept down the hallway slowly, the candle flame dancing wildly with each step. The back door was still locked. The chain was still in place, but something felt profoundly wrong, like the air itself had changed. I stared at the door for several long seconds, trying to breathe normally, trying to think clearly. Then I looked down at the floor. The boots I'd left by the door earlier were gone. Just gone. The mat was empty except for 2 wet outlines where they'd been sitting. I stared at that empty space for what felt like forever, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then I grabbed my phone and finally called emergency services, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The dispatcher was calm and professional, telling me to stay on the line and get somewhere safe with a lock. I told her I was already somewhere safe, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure that meant anything anymore. The police didn't arrive until 1:20. By then, the power had come back on, flooding the house with sudden harsh light. The officers did a full sweep of the property and found nothing. No forced entry, no footprints in the snow except my own from earlier in the day. One of the officers looked at me with barely concealed skepticism and asked, "Could an animal have dragged the boots off?" I said, maybe, because I didn't know what else to say. He didn't look convinced. Honestly, neither was I. They did a quick walk around the property with flashlights, checked the tree line, then told me to call again if anything else happened. Then they left, and I was alone again. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat on the couch with my phone in one hand and the candle still burning on the table, even though the lights were back on. Every sound made me flinch. The fridge humming back to life, the creak of the house settling, the distant sound of wind through the trees. Around 4 in the morning, I finally reached for my phone to text Caleb about everything that had happened, to ask if he knew anything about weird neighbors or previous incidents at the house. There was already a message waiting from him, sent at 12:49, right after the knock. "Don't open the door," I forgot to mention. I stared at those words for a long time, reading them over and over, trying to understand what they meant, what he'd forgotten to tell me. I didn't reply. I didn't pack my things neatly or clean up after myself. I just grabbed my coat and my keys, locked the door behind me, and drove back to the city before the sun even started to rise, leaving everything else behind. I was 22 when this happened, working winter break at Wexley University, a small college buried deep in the hills of northern Maine. I had a part-time job with campus facilities, mostly basic maintenance tasks like snow removal, equipment checks, and building lockups. Most of the time I worked alone, which I actually preferred. There was something peaceful about the solitude, the routine, the predictability of it all. New Year's Eve fell on a Sunday that year. That afternoon, my boss sent me a text asking if I'd cover the overnight shift at the maintenance building. The guy who'd originally been scheduled called out last minute with some vague excuse about a family emergency, and they needed someone present in case of another power outage. We'd had several that week because of the relentless heavy snow, and the administration was paranoid about pipes freezing or heating systems failing. I didn't hesitate to say yes. It was holiday pay, time and a half, and all I had to do was stay awake in the break room, monitor the radio for any emergency calls, and maybe check in once or twice if something came up. Honestly, I saw it as getting paid to have the place to myself for the night. No supervision, no co-workers, just me and whatever I wanted to watch on my phone. It had snowed heavily all day, the kind of steady accumulation that buries everything under a thick white blanket. By evening, the entire campus was deserted and silent, transformed into something that looked like a postcard. We kept a small plow truck in a separate garage behind the main maintenance building. Nothing huge, just a compact utility vehicle with a front blade attached. I was told to take it out around midnight and do a single pass through the staff parking lot to keep the snow from icing over and becoming a hazard. Everything was completely calm until then. I sat in the break room watching something mindless on my phone, microwaved a questionable sandwich from the vending machine, and stared at the same dry erase board that had said, "Do not touch my crowd of coffee mugs," since long before I was hired. The walkie-talkie on the desk remained completely silent. No calls, no check-ins, nothing. Around 11:45, I started getting my stuff together for the plow run. I pulled on my hat, gloves, and heavy coat, grabbed the keys from the lockbox, and headed out into the cold. The building creaked loudly as I stepped outside, the way old structures always do when the temperature drops sharply, like they're stretching and contracting in their sleep. The back lot was buried under at least 4 inches of fresh snow, maybe more in the drifts. I followed a narrow, shoveled path out to the garage, my boots crunching rhythmically in the packed snow. The light over the keypad was glowing faintly orange, almost entirely obscured by a thick crust of frost. I wiped it off with my sleeve and carefully typed in the 4-digit access code. Nothing happened. No green light, no mechanical click, no sound at all. I tried again, slower this time, making sure I hit each number precisely. Still nothing. On the 3rd attempt, I finally heard something. A faint mechanical stutter, like the door motor was trying to engage but couldn't quite manage it. It made a tired, struggling sound, then gave up with a defeated buzz. The door wouldn't rise on its own, so I grabbed the bottom edge and pulled it up by hand. The metal groaned in protest, but eventually moved. I got it up just high enough to duck under, brushing accumulated snow off my shoulders as I stepped inside. Instant, complete blackness. I reached for the light switch near the entrance and flipped it. Nothing happened. Not even a faint hum from the fluorescent tubes overhead. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, the small beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating a narrow cone in front of me. The plow truck was parked exactly where it should have been, facing outward toward the door, ready to go. I figured the garage must have lost power earlier in the storm, which wouldn't be surprising. It had happened the previous winter, too, when ice accumulated on the rooftop transformer and knocked everything out for hours. Still, standing alone in that dark, cold space felt deeply unnerving in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I climbed into the cab of the plow and jammed the key into the ignition, turned it once. The engine gave a dry, hollow cough, then nothing. No clicks. No dashboard lights flickering to life. Just heavy, dead silence, like the battery had been completely drained. I tried again, listening more carefully this time, hoping to hear some sign of life. Same result. That oppressive, mechanical silence. I sat there for a moment, Not moving, just breathing in the stale, cold air. It smelled like old gasoline and rubber and something faintly metallic, like rusted chains left out in the weather too long. I was just about to get out and head back inside to radio it in, maybe call for a backup vehicle or a jump start, when I saw something shift in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a vague blur of movement, something that didn't quite match the static surroundings. I turned off my phone's flashlight and leaned forward, squinting through the narrow view between the dashboard and the windshield, trying to see more clearly. Someone was outside. I could just barely make out a pair of boots pacing slowly back and forth in the snow, right in front of the half-open garage door. Deliberate, measured steps. Then they stopped completely. My hands went clammy inside my gloves. The cold suddenly felt sharper, more invasive, cutting straight through my layers. There was nobody scheduled to be here. Nobody. All the other maintenance staff had signed off hours ago, and the only security presence on campus stayed near the front gate over a quarter-mile away. I held my breath, watching through the mirror, hoping desperately that it was just a confused student who'd stayed on campus for break and gotten lost, or maybe a custodian from the contract cleaning crew who'd wandered into the wrong area. But then I heard it, the keypad outside. Someone was trying to enter the code. First attempt, failure tone. Second attempt, another failure. The beeps were slow, deliberate, like someone was methodically trying different combinations. I slid down in my seat as quietly as possible, pulling my knees up to my chest and making myself as small as I could. My whole body went rigid, every muscle locked in place, trying not to make a single sound. Then my phone buzzed loudly in my pocket. The vibration was so sudden and loud in the oppressive silence that it felt like an explosion. I didn't dare look at it. I just pressed my hand over my pocket, trying to muffle any further sound. On the third keypad attempt, the garage door motor kicked in again with a mechanical groan. This time it managed to rise a few more inches, not all the way, but enough. That's when I saw the gloved hands appear underneath the opening, gripping the bottom edge. He was pulling the door up manually, using brute force to get inside. I pressed myself back into the corner of the cab, wedging myself behind one of the equipment racks, and held completely still. No thoughts, no plans. Just pure animal instinct screaming at me to hide and stay small and don't be seen. When the door rose to about shoulder height, he ducked inside. He wore a dark snow parka with a thick hood pulled up, and he carried a flashlight that cut harsh angles through the darkness. He didn't say a word, didn't call out or announce himself. He just walked with slow, careful, deliberate steps, scanning the garage methodically like he was searching for something very specific. The beam of his flashlight moved across the plow truck, lingered for a moment on the cab where I was hiding, then continued along the walls and over the shelving units. He passed within 5 feet of where I was crouched, and I could hear the faint squeak of his boots compressing the snow that had blown inside. He didn't react to the truck at all, didn't try the door, didn't check if anyone was inside. He just walked straight past it toward the back wall of the garage. There, he paused for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out something thin and metallic. Wires. He took out a second tool, something I couldn't quite identify in the dim light, and crouched low behind the generator housing. His flashlight angled downward, focused and intent. He wasn't exploring. He wasn't lost. He was setting something up, installing something, doing something deliberate and planned. That was enough for me. I shot up from my hiding spot and bolted toward the half-open door as fast as my legs would carry me, not bothering to stay quiet anymore. Stealth didn't matter. Speed did. I heard him move suddenly behind me, maybe even shout something, but I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. The only thing I remember clearly is how sharp and painful the cold air felt on my face as I sprinted across the snow-covered lot, my boots slipping and sliding on the ice beneath. I made it back inside the main building, slammed the heavy door shut behind me, and locked it with shaking hands. My legs felt like they were made of rubber, barely able to support my weight. I grabbed the radio off the desk. Dead. Completely silent. No static. No signal. Nothing. I ran up the back stairwell to the second-floor office, where we kept the backup landline, an old beige phone with a coiled cord mounted on the wall next to the breaker panel. As I reached for it, I finally pulled out my own phone to check what had buzzed earlier. One unread message in our maintenance group chat, sent at 11:40, 15 minutes before I'd even left for the garage. Heads up. Garage code changed earlier today. Don't use backlot tonight. Power got cut deliberately. Be alert. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over, my brain struggling to translate the words into meaning, into understanding what had almost happened. I didn't leave the office again that night. I turned off all the lights, locked the door from the inside, and sat on the cold linoleum floor with my back pressed against the filing cabinet, waiting for sunrise. Just after dawn, 2 campus police officers arrived to do a full sweep of the area. The garage was completely empty when they checked it. No footprints except mine. The plow truck was still dead, battery totally drained, but nothing had been visibly moved or taken. No signs of forced entry, no vandalism, just emptiness and silence. I walked with the officers to the back wall where I'd seen the man crouching. All we found was a pair of stiff work gloves abandoned on the floor and a 6-inch length of wire looped carefully around a bolt on the generator housing. That was it. Nothing else. We checked the security camera footage next. The outdoor feeds covering most of the campus were working fine, but the one camera aimed directly at the break room door, the exact door I'd exited through to go to the garage, had glitched. 20 minutes of footage was completely missing, from exactly 11:40 to midnight. Gone. Just blank screen. No one ever figured out who he was or what he'd been doing. Campus security checked local records, questioned several seasonal workers who'd had access to the facilities. But there were no leads, no credible suspects, no reports of similar break-ins. The incident was filed away as unexplained, and life went on. But I never took another overnight shift. My shift at the lodge ended at 11 on New Year's Eve. It's this rustic cabin rental place tucked deep into the Vermont woods, the kind of spot that markets itself as a peaceful winter retreat for people escaping the chaos of cities. 7 cabins total, spaced out just enough that guests get the comforting illusion of being completely alone, even though the next rental is only a short walk away through the trees. We mostly got people from Boston or New York. Couples looking for romantic getaways, small families wanting to teach their kids what snow actually looks like, and occasionally someone who brought expensive snowshoes they'd clearly never used before and had no intention of actually using. Normally, I'm off for New Year's Eve. It's not a particularly busy night out here. Most people want to be in town for the celebrations. Not isolated in the woods. I like staying home on holidays, heating up leftovers, and watching terrible TV until midnight without any pressure to be social or festive. But the guy who usually handled night maintenance, a chronic screw-up named Colby, had decided to pregame a little too enthusiastically the night before, and completely ghosted on his shift. So management called me in last minute, offering extra pay and the promise that it would be a quiet, easy night. The job itself isn't particularly difficult, just repetitive. Walk the grounds every couple of hours to make sure everything looks normal. Check the heating systems in each occupied cabin, especially the older units that have a tendency to fail in extreme cold. Clear the walkways if it starts snowing heavily. Most importantly, be available for guest calls. If someone can't get their fireplace working properly or hears something unsettling in the walls, they expect immediate assistance and answers. That night, 4 of the 7 cabins were booked, which was actually pretty good for New Year's Eve. I figured I'd do my rounds efficiently, stay warm in the main office between checks, and ride out the shift without incident. Everything was perfectly quiet until about 10:30, when the desk phone rang with a shrill, jarring sound that cut through the silence. Cabin 4. A woman's voice on the other end, tired and slightly annoyed. She said her name was Marlene, and she explained that the lights in the back half of the cabin had been flickering on and off for the past 20 minutes. She wasn't panicked or frightened, just irritated, like this was one more inconvenience in what had probably already been a long day. I told her I'd come check it out right away, grabbed my tools and flashlight, and headed over. When I arrived and knocked, Marlene answered the door with a small, tense smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her husband was visible a few feet back on the couch, hunched over his phone like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. He didn't even glance up when I entered, completely absorbed in whatever he was scrolling through. Marlene said the flickering had actually stopped by the time I got there, but something about the way she said it made me pause. There was an edge of uncertainty in her voice, like she didn't fully believe the problem was actually resolved. I offered to check the breaker panel anyway, just to make sure everything was functioning correctly. At first, she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was noticeable. Then she nodded quickly and stepped aside to let me in. The cabin was clean and warm, carefully decorated in that manufactured cozy style you see in home goods catalogs. It smelled like spiced cider or one of those expensive seasonal candles. Everything looked perfect, staged almost, like a photo shoot for a winter lifestyle magazine. The breaker box was located in a narrow closet near the back bedroom. I opened it up, expecting to find a loose switch or maybe a circuit that had been partially tripped by a power surge. Instead, I found something that made absolutely no sense. One of the breakers was taped in the off position. Black electrical tape, thick and professionally wrapped, not some hasty temporary fix. Someone had taken significant time and effort to make absolutely sure that switch stayed down. I turned to Marlene, who'd followed me down the hallway, and asked carefully if they'd done that themselves for any reason. She stepped closer, looked into the breaker box, and her face went completely pale. All the color drained out in an instant. "No," she said quietly, her voice suddenly small and frightened. "We haven't touched anything since we got here." I peeled the tape off slowly and flipped the switch back to the on position, listening for any unusual sounds or signs of electrical problems. Everything seemed fine, normal, functioning as it should. I told her, trying to sound reassuring, that maybe it had been left that way by the cleaning staff during turnover. Sometimes they tested outlets or isolated circuits for maintenance. It was a weak explanation, and I knew it, but I needed to say something to ease the tension in the room. She nodded slowly, but her expression made it clear she didn't believe me. Neither did I, really. I thanked her for her patience, told her to call the main office if anything else unusual happened, and headed back through the cold night air to my office. By midnight, I was settled in the small garage office we used as a makeshift control center. It's a tiny space, barely big enough for a desk, a struggling space heater, and a few security monitors showing grainy live feeds of the cabin exteriors. I logged the service call in the maintenance book, poured myself another mug of lukewarm coffee, and sat down to wait out the last couple hours of my shift. That's when something on one of the monitors caught my attention. Cabin 7. The feed had just been triggered by motion. That cabin had been completely empty for weeks. No guests, no scheduled maintenance. Not even a cleaning crew had gone through since before Christmas. It should have been dark, silent, undisturbed. I rewound the footage on the security system, my curiosity quickly turning into unease. At exactly 11:56, a figure walked into frame on the porch camera. They wore a big winter coat with a fur-trimmed hood pulled up, obscuring most of their face. They walked up the wooden steps slowly, deliberately, and then stood completely still at the door. No knock, no attempt to open it, just standing there, motionless. Then the feed cut out abruptly for exactly 4 seconds. When it came back, The porch was completely empty. The figure was gone, vanished without a trace. I stared at the screen, rewinding and watching it 3 more times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no logical explanation for how someone could disappear that quickly without leaving any visible trace. I didn't particularly want to go back out into the cold, but policy was clear. If a motion sensor gets triggered, especially on an unoccupied unit, you have to check it out in person. Security liability and all that. I left a note on the desk logging my departure, radioed my status to the main security line, and headed out in the small utility cart we used for getting around the property. The ride out to Cabin 7 is rough in winter. The trail gets unevenly packed with snow and ice, and visibility is never great once you're away from the main floodlights near the office. That night, a thick fog had rolled in as well, the kind of dense, moisture-heavy air that swallows your headlights and muffles every sound. When I finally reached Cabin 7, everything looked completely normal. The cabin was dark, the door was locked. There were no footprints in the snow anywhere near the porch except my own fresh tracks. The porch itself looked completely undisturbed, exactly as it should have been. I even checked behind the railing and around the sides of the structure, just to be thorough. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I figured the camera feed must have glitched, picked up some weird reflection or shadow and interpreted it as motion. It happens sometimes with older systems, especially in bad weather. I was a little irritated at the false alarm, but mostly just cold and ready to get back to the warm office. I started heading back down the trail, my headlights cutting weakly through the fog. Then my radio crackled to life with a burst of static. At first, I thought it was just normal interference, the kind of ambient noise you get sometimes when signals bounce off trees or metal structures. But this wasn't random static. It was breathing, not gasping or strained or panicked. Just slow, rhythmic, deliberate breaths. Steady inhales and exhale. Mechanical almost, like it was being filtered through tubing or recorded and played back. I spun around in the cart, scanning the trees frantically, looking for any sign of movement, any indication of where the sound was coming from. Nothing. Just fog and darkness, and the endless silent trees. I grabbed the radio and called in, asking if anyone else was on my frequency, if there was some kind of cross signal happening. No response. Just that breathing, quiet and relentless and impossibly calm. I turned the radio volume all the way down to nothing and walked the rest of the way back to the office, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run. When I finally got back inside, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, I immediately checked all the security camera feeds again. Cabin 4's feed was down, completely offline. It had been working perfectly 20 minutes earlier when I'd checked the entire grid before heading out. Now it showed nothing but a blank black screen. I called the landline inside Cabin 4. It rang and rang and rang. No answer. So I went back out, driving the cart faster than I probably should have, my headlights bouncing wildly over the uneven trail. Their porch light was on when I arrived. Through the front window, I could see Marlene's husband still sitting in the exact same position on the couch, same posture, same phone in his hands, like he literally hadn't moved a single muscle in the past hour. I knocked on the door firmly. No response. I knocked again, harder this time, loud enough that there was no way they couldn't hear it. Still nothing. I tried the door handle. It was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp wave of frigid air that felt wrong and invasive. It was colder inside the cabin than it was outside, noticeably, unnaturally colder, like all the heat had been deliberately sucked out of the space. Marlene was standing in the kitchen, arms wrapped tightly around herself, visibly shaking. She looked like she'd been frozen in place for a long time, her eyes wide and unfocused. She said, her voice barely above a whisper, that she'd been hearing movement under the bedroom. In the crawl space, not footsteps, but scraping, dragging sounds. like something heavy was being shifted slowly across the wooden beams beneath the floor. I looked over at her husband and asked if he'd heard anything unusual. He didn't even look up from his phone, just mumbled in a flat, emotionless voice, "It's not for us." That response sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I asked Marlene where the crawlspace access panel was located. She didn't answer. She just backed slowly into the corner of the kitchen and shook her head, her whole body trembling. So I went looking myself, moving cautiously through the cabin. In the bedroom, one of the decorative rugs had been kicked aside, revealing the floor beneath. The crawlspace access panel was open about an inch, just slightly ajar, and the dust that had accumulated around the edges was visibly disturbed, like someone had recently been down there. I knelt down carefully and shined my flashlight into the opening. The crawlspace was about 4 feet high. Dirt floor, exposed insulation hanging from the ceiling joists, the usual network of pipes running overhead. Standard construction, nothing unusual. Except for the coat, a parka with a fur-trimmed hood, identical to the one I'd seen in the security footage. It was laid out carefully on the dirt floor, not crumpled or discarded, but folded open deliberately, like someone had positioned it with intention, and underneath the collar, partially tucked inside the fabric, was a human jawbone. Not buried, not hidden, just there, placed deliberately, impossible to miss. I pulled back instantly, my heart hammering in my chest, and stood up so fast I almost hit my head on the doorframe. The radio on my hip suddenly hissed to life with a burst of static. Then a voice whispered through the speaker, low and even and impossibly clear. "You turned it back on." That was all it said. Just those 4 words, delivered with chilling certainty. I walked out of the bedroom, moving quickly but trying not to run, trying not to completely panic. Marlene was crying softly now, tears streaming down her face. Her husband still hadn't moved, still staring at his phone like nothing in the world mattered except whatever was on that screen. I told them, my voice shaking, that they needed to pack a bag immediately. Right now, no explanations, no questions, just grab essentials and come with me. I drove them to cabin 2, the unit closest to the main road, turned the heat up as high as it would go, gave them bottles of water, promised a full refund, and locked the door securely behind them. Then I drove back to cabin 4 alone, went straight to the breaker closet, and flipped every single switch to the off position. The next morning, the owner of the property called and asked about the power outage in cabin 4, why the entire unit had been shut down overnight. I told him a tree branch must have hit the power line and caused a safety hazard. He accepted that explanation without question, made a note in his records, and moved on. Cabin 4 was taken offline the following day for what management called renovations. I never heard from Marlene or her husband again. They never filed a complaint, never left a review. It's like they just vanished after that night. I still work at the lodge, but I never take shifts on New Year's Eve anymore, and I never, ever go near cabin 4. My cousin Mason and I were staying at my Aunt Renee's place for New Year's. She lived by herself in one of those long, sprawling ranch-style houses out near Millersburg, the kind of place that sits on a big piece of land with woods on 3 sides, and neighbors far enough away that you can't see their lights at night. That week, she was off on a ski trip somewhere in Vermont with a group of her friends, and she'd offered to let us stay at her place if we wanted a break from the usual family chaos. My parents hosted a massive New Year's Eve party every single year, loud and crowded and exhausting, full of people I barely knew making forced conversation and asking me questions about college that I didn't want to answer. So yeah, Mason and I were completely on board for a quiet night away from all that. Just the 2 of us with no adult supervision. Mason's mom dropped us off around 3 in the afternoon on New Year's Eve. The roads were already iced over, treacherous and slick, and snow covered absolutely everything like one solid unbroken sheet. No footprints, no tire tracks except the ones we'd just made. Just clean white crust that glittered under the flat gray sky. Before she left, Mason's mom ran through the usual list of house-sitting responsibilities with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Turn off the porch lights before bed to save electricity. Don't leave the fireplace vent open or cold air will come down the chimney all night. Double-check all the locks before you go to sleep. Then she paused at the door, her hand on the frame, and said something that didn't really register as important at the time. You're not in the suburbs out here. Lock up early. Don't wait until you're ready for bed. Then she backed carefully out of the driveway, her tires crunching on the ice, and left us completely alone. We were 16 years old, barely supervised, and had an entire house to ourselves. Of course, we didn't lock up early. We dumped our overnight bags in the guest room, immediately claimed the couch as our territory, and loaded up the living room with every snack we could find in the pantry, plus liters of soda and Mason's Bluetooth speaker with a carefully curated playlist of horror movie soundtracks. It was kind of dumb, kind of fun, and it felt like we were starting our own tradition, something that belonged just to us. By 10 that night, we were eating caramel popcorn straight from the bag, watching an old horror movie marathon on cable, and throwing out ridiculous fake New Year's resolutions. Mason declared he was giving up sugar for a week, maybe tops. I said I'd stop doom-scrolling in bed before sleep, which lasted approximately 1 day. It felt like time had just paused for us, like the night existed outside of normal reality. I got up around 11:30 to use the bathroom and noticed 2 things we'd completely forgotten about in our excitement. The fireplace vent was still wide open, and we hadn't locked the back door. The fireplace wasn't a real wood-burning one. It had one of those fake decorative log inserts that look cozy in photos but don't actually produce any meaningful heat. Still, there was a metal vent that went all the way up the chimney, and when it was open, it let in a steady stream of cold air that had been slowly seeping into the room all night. The metal screen in front of the fireplace had been gently rattling every now and then, a sound I'd been vaguely aware of but hadn't really paid attention to. I'd assumed it was just wind or normal draft pressure, nothing worth investigating. I reached up and pulled the small metal handle to close the vent properly. The rattling stopped immediately, and the sudden quiet made the room feel strangely heavier, more enclosed. Then I walked through the kitchen to check the back door in the laundry room. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the snow on the back deck, fresh ones, not hours old. They came in a straight line from the tree line at the edge of the property, walking deliberately up toward the house. The steps were spaced wide apart, like someone had been walking slowly, carefully, taking their time. The prints were deep, sunken into the snow, and the edges were just starting to crust over from the cold, but they were still clear enough to make out the distinctive tread pattern of boots. What made my stomach drop, what made everything feel immediately wrong, was the direction. The footprints only led toward the door. There was no trail going back, no returning path, no indication that whoever had walked up to the house had ever left. I locked the door immediately, my hands fumbling slightly with the deadbolt, and flicked off the kitchen light so I could see outside more clearly without my reflection getting in the way. I stood there in the darkness for several long seconds, pressing my face close to the cold glass, scanning the deck and the yard beyond. I didn't see anything moving out there. No shadows shifting between the trees, no rustling branches. Just those footprints, ending abruptly at the welcome mat, like someone had simply walked up and then vanished. I called Mason over, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. He came into the kitchen and I pointed at the window. At first, he tried to play it cool, shrugging and suggesting that maybe a delivery person or a neighbor had stopped by earlier in the day and we just hadn't noticed. But I pointed out the obvious problems with that theory. The snow was completely undisturbed except for those single tracks. Nothing had walked over them or through them. They hadn't been there long enough to start melting or filling in. They were fresh, recent, made within the last hour or so. Mason got quiet then, his whole body language changing, tension creeping into his shoulders. We went through the house room by room, methodically checking every single lock, every window latch, testing them all to make sure they were secure. Nothing else was open or unlocked. Just that one back door, which I was absolutely certain I'd checked earlier, but apparently hadn't. We heard fireworks in the distance as midnight hit, faint pops and crackles echoing across the valley from town. Mason cracked a nervous joke, something like, "Happy New Year, hope we don't get murdered," and forced a laugh that didn't quite land. He went back to the living room, but I stayed in the kitchen for another long minute, still staring out at the deck, trying to convince myself that those prints weren't as weird or threatening as they looked, that there was some perfectly reasonable explanation I just wasn't thinking of. Then I heard it again, the sound I'd dismissed earlier. The metal screen in front of the fireplace was rattling, again, but I'd already closed the vent. I'd felt the handle click into the locked position. The rattling should have stopped completely. I walked slowly back into the living room. Mason had the TV remote in his lap but wasn't pressing any buttons. He was just sitting there, staring at the fireplace, his face pale and tense. There were ash smudges scattered across the brick hearth now, faint grey streaks that definitely hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier when I'd closed the vent. The screen started moving again, shaking slightly, not violently but persistently. Slow, uneven movements, like someone on the other side was trying to nudge it open without making too much noise, testing to see if it would give. Not loud, not aggressive, just relentless. I told Mason to step back away from the fireplace. He didn't argue or question me. He just stood up immediately and moved toward the hallway. Then the screen suddenly tipped forward with a metallic clatter and fell onto the floor, scattering more ash across the rug in a cloud of fine grey dust. We both jumped back at the same time, our hearts pounding. Nothing came out of the fireplace, no sounds from inside the dark opening, but just behind the metal grate, barely visible in the shadows, something dark and solid was wedged into the accumulated soot. I leaned in just far enough to see the edge of what looked unmistakably like a boot heel. Black, worn, caked with grime and ash. I said, my voice tight and urgent, "We're leaving, right now." Mason didn't argue, didn't ask questions. He just nodded, and we both moved at once. We grabbed our phones from the couch. I snatched my aunt's spare car keys from the decorative bowl near the front door, the ones she kept for emergencies, even though neither Mason nor I had our driver's licenses yet. That didn't matter anymore. Nothing about rules or legality mattered in that moment. I moved toward the front door, ready to unlock it and sprint to the car. Before I could touch the handle, I looked through the small window panel beside the door. More footprints. Fresh ones, pressed deep into the snow on the front porch. They came from the same direction as before, from the woods in that same deliberate straight line. And again, they stopped right at the door. No path leading away, no indication of retreat. Just stopped, like whoever had made them was still standing right there on the other side of the door, waiting silently. I slammed the door shut, or rather kept it closed, and locked it as fast as I could, my hands shaking violently. We spun around, deciding instantly without speaking that we'd go out through the kitchen instead, through the back door I'd locked earlier, and make a run for the car that way. But when we reached the laundry room, the back door was open. Not wide, just a few inches, but definitely, unmistakably open. I had locked it. I absolutely, completely remembered the physical sensation of the bolt sliding into place, the resistance, and then the click. There was no way I'd imagined that. No possible way. We stood, frozen, just staring at that gap, at the cold night air seeping in through the opening. Then the floor creaked, twice, deep, deliberate sounds from inside the laundry room, just out of sight around the corner. Not the random settling sounds old houses make, not wood contracting from temperature change. Footsteps. Someone stepping carefully, slowly, testing their weight on the floorboards. We didn't discuss it. We didn't make a plan. We just bolted. Mason grabbed the fireplace poker from its stand, gripping it like a weapon. I yanked open the nearest kitchen drawer and pulled out the biggest knife I could find, a chef's knife with a heavy blade. We sprinted down the hallway to my aunt's bedroom at the far end of the house and slammed the door shut behind us with all our weight. It had a lock on the knob. One of those button locks that's flimsy but better than nothing, and we turned it immediately, then pressed our backs against the door, breathing hard. We waited, listening with every fiber of our beings. The door handle turned. Almost immediately. Just a slow testing rotation, like someone was checking to see if it was locked, seeing if we'd made a mistake. Then nothing. No footsteps walking away, no sound of retreat. Just absolute silence on the other side of the door, thick and waiting. We didn't move. We barely breathed. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and tried calling Mason's mom. It rang and went to voicemail. I tried my own parents. Same thing. Voicemail. Finally, I found the local sheriff's non-emergency number online and called it, my voice cracking and unsteady as I gave them the address and tried to explain that someone was in the house, that we were locked in a bedroom and couldn't get out safely. The dispatcher was calm and professional, telling us a patrol car was close by and would be there within 10 minutes, that we should stay exactly where we were and not try to leave the room. When we finally saw the red and blue lights flashing through the bedroom window, reflecting off the snow outside, I almost started crying from relief. The officer who responded did a complete sweep of the property. He checked every room, every closet, the attic, the basement, outside, around the perimeter. No one was there. The house was completely empty. He found the footprints outside, noted them in his report, but said they could have been from earlier in the day, maybe a delivery person or a neighbor checking on the property. He didn't seem particularly concerned, and I didn't know how to explain that we knew they were fresh, that we'd watched them appear, that doors had been unlocked from the inside. My Aunt Renee sold the house that summer without explanation. She bought a condo in town, closer to other people, and never once mentioned that night or asked us what had happened. Mason and I don't talk about it. We've never discussed it since. Not once in all the years that have passed. But I've never spent another New Year's Eve in a house that remote, that isolated, that far from help. And I never will. Jamie, my cousin on my mom's side, invited me to this quiet New Year's gathering she was putting together. Nothing elaborate or social, just a small group getting away for the weekend at her family's old hunting cabin up in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania, a couple hours from anywhere with reliable cell service or modern conveniences. We'd all had incredibly rough years, individually and collectively, and I think everyone involved just desperately wanted a break from regular life, from work obligations, from the constant noise of trying to hold everything together while the world fell apart around us. When Jamie sent me the text invitation, I didn't even hesitate before saying yes. I'd been running on absolute fumes for months, barely sleeping, barely functioning. When I needed somewhere, I could just collapse without expectations or judgment. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon on December 30th. The place looked exactly like you'd picture when someone says, old hunting cabin. Small and weathered, with a slanted roof that had clearly seen better decades, tucked back off a dirt road that barely qualified as a driveway anymore. It was one of those structures that felt like it had settled too deep into the earth over the years, sinking gradually into the ground that held it. Her family used it mostly during deer season in the fall, so the interior smelled distinctly of old gun oil and accumulated wood smoke, with an underlying musty quality that clung stubbornly to the walls and furniture, no matter how much you aired it out. You know the kind of place I mean. Every single floorboard has its own unique voice, its own creak and groan, and the silence that surrounds the building feels unnaturally thick, almost oppressive. Jamie had brought along Milo, her black and white mixed-breed dog with one cloudy eye that always made him look like he was staring through you instead of at you, seeing something beyond normal perception. He didn't warm up to strangers easily, never had, but he was intensely loyal to Jamie in that protective way that made you wonder if the two of them had survived something traumatic together at some point. He wasn't a big barker under normal circumstances. He was just very observant, very aware, always seeming like he was waiting and watching for something even when he appeared to be resting. Outside, the snow had started falling in the late afternoon. Slow and lazy at first, like it was settling in comfortably with us for the long night ahead. By 10 o'clock, the windows were completely covered with accumulated snow, and the world outside looked like we were trapped inside a snow globe that someone had forgotten to shake again. Around 10:30, Milo started pacing through the cabin. It wasn't dramatic or frantic at first, just a slow, methodical loop from the fireplace to the front door and back again, over and over. No barking, no whining, just this steady rhythm of claws ticking rhythmically across the old floorboards. You could hear it clearly even over our conversation, which had been relaxed and casual until that sound started to dominate the space and make us all uncomfortable. Jamie called him over several times, using her most authoritative voice, but he didn't even glance in her direction. He just kept doing his circuit, like he was compelled to follow some invisible track. At first, we all tried to dismiss it with logical explanations. New environment, new smells, unfamiliar territory. Maybe he was hearing mice or some other small animal scurrying around in the walls. Normal cabin stuff, but the pacing didn't stop. In fact, it got tighter, more anxious, more urgent. The loops got smaller and faster. Then suddenly he froze completely at the front door, his entire body going rigid. His tail dropped low. His shoulders locked, and then he let out this sound I'd never heard from him before. A low, constant growl. Not loud or aggressive, almost like he was trying desperately not to make noise, but physically couldn't help it. Like instinct was overriding his training. That's when the atmosphere in the room started to feel fundamentally different. The air got heavier. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, even though the fire was still burning steadily. Jamie stood up from her chair and asked if anyone else had heard something unusual. None of us had heard anything beyond Milo's growling. I grabbed the TV remote and muted it completely. For a long moment, we all just sat there in the sudden silence, listening intently, straining to hear whatever Milo was reacting to. You could hear the wind outside, faint but steady, moving through the trees. Nothing else, just wind and the crackle of burning wood. Then it came. 2 soft, deliberate knocks on the back door. It honestly felt like a scene from a horror movie, that perfectly timed moment of dread. We all looked at each other with wide eyes. And Jamie let out a nervous laugh, forced and unconvincing, and asked if one of us was somehow messing around, playing a prank. But here's the thing that made that impossible. The back door didn't have a cleared path leading to it. We'd all come in through the front entrance earlier, because that was the only part of the property that had been shoveled recently. The back door opened directly into dense woods, and the snow back there was completely untouched, pristine and undisturbed. Even animal tracks hadn't gone through that area yet. Micah, who'd been sitting quietly until then, grabbed a large flashlight from the equipment bag and said with more confidence than he probably felt that he'd go check it out, make sure everything was fine. We all followed him because nobody wanted to be left behind in the cabin. He flipped on the exterior floodlight, and it cast a pale, sickly yellow cone of light across the backyard, illuminating the snow in harsh detail. We all crowded behind him, looking over his shoulders. Nothing. Absolutely nothing out there. No footprints, no drag marks, no disturbed snow whatsoever. The entire area was smooth and untouched, like freshly fallen powder that nothing had walked through. I remember thinking how sharp and theatrical the edges of the light looked against that perfect white surface, like we were standing at the edge of a stage set, staring into a blank backdrop. Micah actually stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow, and walked several feet out from the door, scanning the dark tree line carefully with his flashlight beam. Then he came back inside, shaking his head in confusion, and locked the door again with deliberate force. Nobody said anything. What could you possibly say that would make sense of that? We went back to the main room, turned the TV volume back up louder than before, and desperately tried to act like everything was normal and fine. But Milo wouldn't stop. He stayed locked onto the front door now, his body tense and coiled, his ears twitching constantly. At one point, he started walking slowly toward the door, then stopped abruptly halfway across the room and sat down hard, like he desperately didn't want to get any closer but couldn't ignore whatever he was sensing. Then, at exactly 11:42, the power went out. No warning flicker, no gradual dimming, just an immediate, total stop. The heater shut off with a mechanical sigh. The TV went black. All the lights disappeared instantly. Complete darkness and sudden, crushing silence, the kind of quiet that feels full of waiting and menace. Jamie pulled a flashlight out of her bag with practiced efficiency. I turned on my phone's flashlight, but the beam was pathetically weak, useless beyond a couple of feet. We went to check the breaker box together, moving as a group because nobody wanted to be alone. Nothing looked obviously wrong or tripped, but none of us were electricians, and we definitely didn't want to open the door and go outside to mess with the external fuse box in the dark. Nobody said out loud what we were all thinking, that we should leave, get in the car, and drive back to civilization. But we all knew the access road was completely buried under snow by now. Even if the car would start in this cold, it wouldn't get more than a few feet before getting hopelessly stuck. We were trapped here until morning. That realization settled into my stomach like a cold, heavy stone. Then Milo barked, a single, sharp, explosive bark that cut through the silence like a gunshot. And the front door handle moved. I saw it clearly. We all did. That slow, deliberate turn of the knob, the metal rotating smoothly, like someone on the other side was testing a key. They weren't entirely sure still worked, seeing if the door was locked or if they could simply walk in. The handle rotated about 45 degrees, then stopped, paused, then slowly returned to its original position. Bennett froze in place. Jamie swore under her breath, a sharp exhale of fear. Micah moved forward one step, then stopped, clearly torn between investigating and staying back. None of us wanted to be the person closest to that door. I leaned in slowly, not sure why I was doing it, drawn by some horrible curiosity, and pressed my ear carefully against the cold wood. Nothing. Not a sound. Not breathing. Not footsteps. Not fabric rustling. Just oppressive, waiting silence. At 11:54, we heard another knock. This time it came from directly above us, from the ceiling, from the attic. Jamie's head snapped up, her flashlight beam following her gaze. She said quietly, her voice shaking, that no one had been up in that attic in years. It was just old insulation and mouse traps, no stored furniture, no boxes, nothing worth keeping up there. Just an empty space with one small access hatch in the ceiling of the hallway. Micah grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly, and slowly climbed the rickety wooden ladder we'd pulled down from the hallway ceiling. He had his flashlight in his other hand, the beam shaking as he ascended. We stayed at the bottom, looking up, barely breathing, listening to every creak of the ladder under his weight. He didn't find anyone up there. The attic was empty, just like Jamie had said. But the access hatch, which should have been closed and latched, was hanging open, and the thick layer of dust that had coated the edges of the frame was wiped away in a wide, sweeping arc, like someone had recently pushed it open from below, using their head or shoulders to force it up. We didn't even try to rationalize it after that. No more theories. No more nervous laughter or attempts to explain things away. We just accepted that something was wrong, something was happening that we couldn't understand or control. We dragged the heavy couch across the floor, scraping it loudly across the wood, and positioned it as close to the fireplace as we could get. Then we all sat there together, pressed close, not talking, just waiting. Milo finally lay down under the coffee table. But even then he didn't relax. He kept watching the front door with intense focus, like his job wasn't finished, like he was still on guard duty. Midnight came and went. No cheers, no countdown, no celebration. Just cold, shared silence and the sound of our own breathing and the crackling fire. Then the bang came, a single, massive slam against the exterior wall of the cabin, so loud and violent that it shook dust from the ceiling beams. We all jumped simultaneously. Milo exploded into frantic barking, the loudest and most aggressive I'd ever heard from him, but even he didn't run toward the source of the noise. He just barked from his position under the table, warning something away. Then came another sound, a long, slow scraping like something heavy and solid was being dragged deliberately around the outside perimeter of the building. The sound moved steadily, methodically, from the far corner of the structure toward the back. You could track its progress with your ears, following it as it circled around us. No one moved. No one spoke. We just sat there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Then I whispered something. I don't even remember what. Maybe I suggested we look outside, or maybe I just made some sound of terror. Micah and I locked eyes, and without discussing it, we both crept slowly toward the kitchen window. We crouched low beneath the sill, waited, listened to our hearts pounding, and then finally looked out together. What we saw made no sense whatsoever. There was one long, deep trench carved through the snow, running in a perfectly straight line from deep in the woods all the way to the foundation of the cabin. No footprints accompanied it, no tracks of any kind. Just that single furrow, like something massive and heavy had been pulled or dragged across the ground. And at the very end of that line, right where it met the cabin's stone foundation, there was a perfect circle pressed into the snow, not deep like someone had stomped it, just clean and deliberate, like someone or something had been standing there perfectly still for a long time, turning slowly in place. And then nothing. No trail leading away from that circle. No indication of how, whatever made it, had left. Just that one impossible path leading in, and then nothing. That was it for all of us. No more debate. No more waiting to see what happened next. We grabbed whatever we could carry, didn't even bother packing properly, and ran to the car. We all piled in, and I started the engine with shaking hands. We slept in the car that night with the engine running for heat, parked as far down the access road as we could manage without getting stuck. Milo finally relaxed once we were away from the cabin, curling up in the back seat and falling into exhausted sleep. In the morning, when the sun finally rose and gave us enough light and courage to return, we checked the area around the cabin one more time. The trench was still there, clear and unmistakable in the daylight. The circle had started to fill in slightly with blowing snow, but you could still see its outline. We left within the hour, not bothering to clean up or secure the cabin properly. We just wanted to be gone. Jamie sold the hunting cabin through a realtor a few months later. She never went back to see it again, and we haven't talked about that night since. Not once. It's like we made an unspoken agreement to just never speak of it, and to pretend it didn't happen. But every New Year's Eve now, I make absolutely sure I'm somewhere loud. Somewhere crowded. Somewhere with music and lights and people and noise. Somewhere nothing can creep up quietly in the dark. Somewhere I'll never be alone in the silence again.